In the previous tutorial, we got our application up and running out in the cloud, but unfortunately we were running on port 3000 in the wild, and that's not what we want. So today we're going to set up Nginx as a web server in front of our Rails application server to improve our deployments, make it faster, and make it more approachable on the web. I've set up a subdomain on my CoderJourney domain to point to the IP address of our Docker host that we have that we're running our meal planning application on in production, but we're still running on port 3000, so I can access it from meals.coderjourney.com:3000. But ideally, what I want to be able to do is I want to go to meals.coderjourney.com and just have that work. And right now that's not going to work for us. So that's what we're going to work on fixing today. We'll do most of our work just going against localhost, where I also have this running in production, and we'll get it to where we can go to /localhost and still be connected to our meal plan application. There are a few main reasons we want to do this. One of them is the assets. If you remember from the previous tutorial, whenever we first went to localhost 3000 or to the actual production Docker host 3000, it was really, really slow on first load. And that was because it had to pre-compile the assets, and then the Rails itself was actually serving those assets to us. Well, Rails serving files isn't the fastest thing in the world. And that's not really its specialty. It's there to handle business logic and actually run some code and give you dynamic information. So what we're going to do is we're going to pre-compile our assets as part of our build process, and then we're going to pass those assets over to a web server, Nginx in this case, and have Nginx serve those static files. That'll mean our first load will be really fast, and we won't have to worry about having that extra load put onto our Rails server. Additionally, we're going to set up Nginx to be a proxy to our Rails host, and what that'll allow us to do is have Nginx constantly running, and then it will be taking any request that comes to it that should be going to whatever we tell it to go to, and then it's going to route that to our Rails application. When you get into more complicated stuff with this, you can actually set it up to where you have multiple Rails applications running that are all running the same code, but you have so much traffic that not one can handle it, and Nginx can proxy to all of those in such a way that you won't overwhelm any one of those Rails applications. Enough with the hypotheticals, though. Let's see what we can do. Going over here, I do want to address one thing, and that is docker compose-if docker compose-prod.yaml really sucks to type out. So we're going to get rid of this, and we're going to do something else. And I would normally set this up as an alias in my shell, and this is something that you can do both on a Unix system and if you're on Windows. I will set a link in the blog post for this to show you how to set up an alias. But for the time being, I'm going to set it up as a script file in here, but this won't work for people running this on Windows, so just keep that in mind. But we're going to go and take a look at script prod, which doesn't exist yet, and we're going to set this up to use bin bash. I will give it an E so it'll raise the errors. And we're actually just going to have all that extra stuff. So it's going to be docker compose-f, docker compose.prod.yaml, and then it's going to pass in this thing right here. So $ampersand and double quotes. And this just means anything we were going to pass to script prod is going to be directly passed into this one line. The formatting here is pretty much magic, but just trust me, this is what it needs to be. So we can save that. We need to make it executable. So chmod +x script prod. And now we can do stuff like script prod ps. And it will look only for the things that are running inside of our Docker Compose prod file. So this will just make our life way easier, much less to type, and it can autocomplete most of it for us. So back to what I was talking about with the assets portion. I said we were going to pre-compile our assets as part of our build process. And if you remember, if we take a look at our Docker Compose prod file, you'll see that we're using on line 15 here, we're using this exact same build step, which means we're using the same Docker file. And that's not going to quite work out for us, so we're going to make a separate Docker file for when we're doing production that's going to be basically the same as our original one, except for it's going to have that extra step for asset pre-compilation. So we can cp Docker file, and we'll make it dockerfile.prod. And then we'll take a look at that file. We're going to leave everything the same up until this copy, and then we're just going to pre-compile our assets. So we're going to set env to make sure that we're running in the production Rails environment. And then we're going to run Rails assets precompile. If you look for this on the internet, you can also see rake assets precompile, and they're sort of interchangeable, but the Rails community as a whole, as of Rails 5, is kind of moving towards these jobs being ran by Rails instead of by rake directly. So we're going to save this, and then now we have to modify our Docker compose file. And we're going to change it by where we have build right here. We're going to get rid of this dot. And there's a few extra things. We can say context, and this means what directory are you going to be pointed at. And then if it were just called Dockerfile, that would be sufficient. That's actually what we had before when we had build dot. It was just saying the context is right here. But we can also define a Dockerfile, and this will be dockerfile.prod. So let's just make sure this works. So we'll do script prod build prod app. This should be mostly fast, except for now you can see that we've run into our Rails asset precompilation. This will be a little bit slower than normal, but it'll go and it'll create the compiled assets for us. And you'll notice it creates a compiled gzipped version of these too. So this will come in handy. We can actually serve some compressed assets to the browser, and that'll be even faster. The next thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to figure out how to get our assets out of public assets, whatever, into our web server, but we have to create the web server first. So for that, we're going to go back into our Docker Compose prod YAML, and we're going to create a new service. And we're just going to call this web server. We're going to use an image for this, be Nginx 1.11.8. And I'm not sure if I've ever spoken about this, but we should always be using a tag with our images because latest is not a version number. So right here what we're doing where we say Postgres with nothing there, this is bad. We need to change this. I should figure out what exact version of Postgres I want to be running and pin that here. Because you can't exactly roll back from latest. Like if you accidentally upgraded somehow, you would have no way to go back, because you were only ever using the latest tag, so you don't even actually know what versions you have on your machine. So just keep that in mind. Anytime you're doing something for production, always tag your images. We're going to set this up to use the same env file that we were. Ports-wise, this is going to pass through a couple things. So we're going to take over the main HTTP port. So this is your standard. If you go to localhost on any server and it doesn't have SSL or doesn't have the HTTPS, you're on port 80. And then we'll also pull over the 443. This is your SSL port. Okay, now we're going to need volumes. And we want one, we're going to call it assets. And this is going to go to USR, share, Nginx HTML. And this is the default place where Nginx will just serve assets from. And then we're also going to move over something called configs. And we're going to put this in etc nginx conf.d, which is a directory that holds site configuration files for Nginx. Well, configuration in general. So we can create these as extra things up here. So we're going to have assets, external false, and configs external false. So down in our prod app area, we're also going to tie into these volumes. So we will set assets to USR, share, Nginx HTML, and configs to etc nginx conf.d. And I'll get to why we're going to do this in a second, but volumes are going to be the trick for us to get files from prod app into the web server. Unfortunately, this doesn't work the way you would ideally want it to do. And that is ideally when I serve up a new prod app or I restart my image, build a new container with it, I want it to update what is inside of the volume. Unfortunately, that is not what happens directly. So that's why we're doing something that's a little weird here. You notice that neither one of these paths are inside of our app, inside of the container, right? You remember our working directory is USR src app, and neither of these paths are in there. And that's because it wouldn't matter even if it was, we would only ever update this once. So if we put these into USR src app, then the first time we built our image, we would create the volumes and then populate it with what we had. But every time we would rebuild our container from that point on, it would never override it because the web server container would already be connected to it. And Docker says, nope, I'm not going to blow this away if something else is already talking to it. So that's why we're going to do something a little bit more clever here in a second, just to make sure that this always updates the way we want it to. We're going to extend our depends on down here to also include the web server. Okay, we're almost finished. The thing we're missing now is we want some sort of configuration that we can pass to the web server so that it knows how to connect to our prod app. So for that, we're just going to create something called site.conf. The name of this literally doesn't matter. We're going to rename it in a second anyway. This is an Nginx configuration file. Nginx technically has its own language that is Turing complete, so you can actually write real programs in this, but it's not exactly recommended. So I'm just going to blitz through some of this stuff, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it. All right, let's take a look at what we've got here. We have two blocks, essentially, that are going to be handled a little bit different. And that is, if somebody goes to the location of / then what we're going to do is we're going to proxy to our application. So remember that we are inside of a container that is running on the same network as our prod app. So it can talk to prod app as prod_app. So let's take a look at this one first. The X forwarded for and the host are just saying that we want to make these headers passed on. And then the proxy pass means we want to pass our cookies over to. So the reason you need this proxy pass header set cookie is otherwise your authentication, every time you try to submit a form on your Rails application, it will fail with a CSRF token error. And that doesn't really do you a whole lot of good. And then the proxy pass, this just says, okay, if anybody makes one of these requests, make sure you're passing along all of this information properly, but then actually send it to the same location just on the prodapp:3000. So if you go to /recipes, then it's going to go to prodapp:3000 /recipes, but under the, you won't actually see that. You'll see it as localhost /recipes. And then looking at this block up here, we say, this one's a little more complicated, uses a regular expression, but it's basically saying that location, if it says assets, like if it has assets in there, then you're going to serve it to a different location. So, and the reason they're ordered this way is because if we put the location / above the location assets, then technically this rule would match. And yeah, it wouldn't actually make it to our Rails, or it would go to our Rails app instead of going to our static assets. So here we're saying if it has /assets as the beginning of the URL, then send it to that same spot, just instead of assets, you'll have it be USR share Nginx HTML, work with gzip, and then you're going to do some caching for us. Yeah, so this is how we actually rig up serving static assets. Okay, before we get too far, let's script prod up the web server. Whoops, looks like we have an issue. It's not spelled Nginx. So let's go back into our Docker Compose prod file and fix that. And try again. Okay, cool. If we bounce back over to our browser, we should be able to go to localhost 80 and see the Nginx splash page. There we go. You'll notice that if we go to /recipes right now, it's not going to do anything. And that's because we're using an off-the-shelf Nginx image, and that doesn't allow us to pass any of our local files into it directly. If we wanted to do that, we could create a separate Docker file for building our Nginx image, and then we would pass in our configuration. But we're going to do it slightly different. Building a separate Docker file for a custom Nginx image would be the better way to do it. We're going to do it kind of a more quick and dirty way right now. And so what we need to do is we need to change script start. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change this to be bash, just so it's a little easier to work with. And then we're going to set it -e here so that it can pick up our errors and pass them back to us. We're going to set an entirely different if block here. So we're going to say if the Rails environment is production, then we're going to do a bunch of different things in here. So we're going to say rake assets precompile. And since we did this in the image, these assets are already going to exist. So this is going to be really fast. It's not going to take nearly as long as if we were doing it the first time. But just in case something goes wrong. Next up, we're going to make a directory for USR, share Nginx HTML. And here's how we're going to update what Nginx is actually serving. We're going to just copy it. So we're going to copy everything that is in public. So public.star. And we're going to copy this to that directory above. And we're going to do the same thing for etc nginx conf.d. And then we're going to move over our site.conf into etc nginx conf.d. And we're going to call this default.conf just in case we ever go into our web server container and look at these. We'll know that, oh, this is the default application that this web server is handling. We're going to go back and we're going to spin up our application container again. And this is going to be kind of a cool example of what it's like to redeploy. And for that, we're going to use script prod. We're going to do up d -- build on prod app. So just as a test here, we're going to grab one of these. So we'll go application assets JavaScript. This would be something we should be able to go to assets/that. And there you go. But let's see if we can go to our actual application. That we cannot, and that's because we modified a configuration. So by default, the USR share Nginx HTML, that's automatically going to get served anyway. So we move stuff in there and that's already being served, but we didn't tweak any of the configurations of the actually running web server. So we need to restart our web server. So for this, we will use script prod restart web server. I almost never opt to use Docker Compose restart. This is one example of it doesn't actually matter though, because we are just restarting the process, and that's okay. Now, if we bounce back over here and we reload, you'll see that we are indeed looking at our application. But right now we can't tell, is this because the Rails application is serving assets, or is this because Nginx is serving assets? We never changed our environment variables, so we really don't know. Rails still thinks it is its job to compile these assets and serve them up. So we need to go change that. So if we look at our production.rb file, you can see that Rails serves static files. If it exists, then it's going to go off and do that. Another thing that we didn't actually do is down here, there's this option to Rails log to standard out. If it is there, then that's how it's going to do the logging. And we should have actually set this when we move to production because Docker logs works on standard out. So let's change our production env file. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add this. So we're just going to add Rails log to standard out, true. And then the other thing, remember, it needs to exist. So if we put false here, and that doesn't actually do anything. So we just need to comment this out. Then we can save it. And now we're going to have to actually tear down our web server and spin it back up and do the same thing with our prod app container. So script prod, and you can actually do upd web server. This will do the same thing. Turns out it'll stop it and then spin it back up. And then we can do the same thing with prod app. And just to verify, we're going to do a script prod exec prod app bash, and then we will just take a look at the env and we'll grep for Rails. So you'll notice that we have a Rails environment of true, and then log to standard out is true here too. So that's cool. If we come back over to localhost and we refresh the page, then now we know for certain that Rails is definitely not working with these assets. Before we go too far, we should make sure that everything is working out. So I don't have an account here. I will create one. And that worked. Sign me right in. And I can also create a new recipe. And you can see that here too. Everything we've done up to this point is just like it would be in production. So just to be thorough, we're going to go and actually connect to our Docker host in production and go from there. So if we look at Docker machine ls, we just grep for meals, you'll see that I do have one running in DigitalOcean. And so we need to connect to that. We'll do that by eval docker machine env and then the name. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do script prod upd web server. And we're starting this one first so that our Nginx 500 file and 404 and those things are actually the things that go into USR share Nginx HTML, because we do want those to exist all the time. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go and on top of that add our Rails asset. So that's why we did this one first. And then the next thing we're going to do is going to be script prod upd -- build prod app. And then we can also give it a no deps so that it doesn't try to restart our database. And when you have a purely application change, this one line is going to be the line that you'll use in order to deploy that application change with the most minimal amount of impact on the rest of your containers. So we'll take a look at that again here in a second. So it's script prod, which let's just expand this out in our minds. This is Docker Compose with a special Docker file passed to it. Upd -- build so that you know you're building a new image with your new contents. And then -- no deps just means whatever we say that this service depends on, we're not going to do anything to that. We're only going to work with our own service. All right. So now if we go to meals.coderjourney.com, we refresh this, you'll see that we got our Nginx page, but building our app container is actually the thing that went off and changed that. So we have to script prod restart web server. And now if we refresh the page, you'll see that it actually routes us into our Rails application. There's a lot more that we can do to really make our application feel professional and to secure it and make it even faster with Nginx, but we're not going to be able to get into those things right now. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and the fact that we have actually taken our application from nothing to deployed on its own domain. You can feel pretty good about that. I encourage you to dig deeper into Nginx and figure out what other kinds of things you can do with deploying using Docker. I'm sure that it's going to come up in more tutorials moving forward, but I really hope that you enjoyed this. And I want your feedback on this and any of the other tutorials that I've given, but I also am looking for advice on where I should go next after Rails. I've had a few suggestions, a lot of them still relating to ops-related things. So more deployment-related stuff, more working with Docker and containers and additional things on top of that for orchestration like Kubernetes. So let me know if you want me to go down that route or if you'd rather me go down a more programming related route using programming languages or different software things, like if I should do a deep dive on databases. Give me your feedback. I really like to know. But until then, it would be really cool if you could like, share, subscribe to the channel, and also head over to CoderJourney.com and subscribe to the newsletter. I did recently release a course on using Docker in development that dives really deep into actual Docker and making sure that everything that you do in Docker, you understand why it works. And so if you want to check that out, go over to courses.coderjourney.com to see that course and any other course that I release.